Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar, Laying the Foundation, Data Modeling for Healthcare BI. This is Laura Madsen, the Healthcare Practice Leader for Lancet. Thank you so much for taking time today to sit with me and talk a little bit about data modeling for healthcare. We're going to talk at a relatively high level about what this work really entails, but more than the work itself is the structure and how to approach the work. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll attempt to make what I consider a pretty serious topic at least a little bit interesting. So we'll see how I do. So I have to admit that for a very long time, and probably still a little bit to this day, the consideration of building out a data model for healthcare always brought a little bit of terror to my heart. And I've been doing this work for a long time, and I've seen it done really, really badly. And I know that the impact that can have downstream. And so there always feels to me like a lot of pressure when we start to tackle data modeling for healthcare. So that's this part of me, this part that gets that terror perspective, is less now than it was a couple of years ago, but I always have that little moment where, geez, how much can we really screw up? So if you have that same feeling as you're doing this work or getting started, you are not alone, for sure. So if you Google data modeling, or if you Google data modeling for healthcare, I think what you'll find is a lot of competing discussions, and some of them are very passionate, right, about who does what right, and how to do this and how to do that. And I recently, within the last 6 months or so, I read a number of posts from competing factions about how you do this work, specifically for healthcare. One faction said essentially, look, healthcare is so dynamic and so complex that there's no way that you can do it in bits and pieces. You have to do it all. And you have to sit down and figure out every aspect of healthcare, and then you have to model that out. Otherwise you're gonna forget something or missed something. And then the other faction is saying the complete opposite. Because it's so dynamic, because it's so complicated, you could never possibly look at every aspect of healthcare and then model it. You would be doing nothing but modeling and never delivering value. So think about value first, and then deliver some data models. So it's sort of this all or nothing perspective on data modeling, and is either one of them correct? I guess it probably depends on your perspective, but I'm guessing that there's probably something somewhere in the middle. From my perspective, when we talk about data modeling, what we really want to talk about is value. And that's not always the conversation that you have when you are considering a data model. There are lots of other conversations that generally come first, like, gee, should we or shouldn't we, or how do you go about it, who has the right skill set, and what kind of tools do we use. There's so many other conversations about data modeling that oftentimes that conversation that should be very first never happens at all. And it really is about the value of delivering the data model itself, and then of course the reason for the data model, which is the data in a usable format for self-service. So I think when we start having conversations about data modeling, in particular to our business peers, we really have to make sure that the conversation is around the value. And certainly there is a cost versus high risk perspective that we all always have to balance. The idea here is that if you don't model your data, what risk will you be at? And balance that against how much will you spend over time modeling your data to ensure usage. And that conversation has to be unique to your organization. I can't counsel you on that because every organization varies on their ability to consume risk or spend money on something like this. But I do encourage you to have the conversation in the context of value when you're trying to get a data modeling effort passed. Now, One question that always gets presented to me when I start talking to clients is, well, how do you encourage your executives to understand the value of data models? Because to them, a data model is just a drawing, right? They don't really understand the tangible value associated with the work product. And my best advice to you is tell them this is how you avoid lawyers. So let me give you a scenario, and this is a true example, and if any of you out there have worked with me in the past, I've probably said this example to you before, so please forgive me repeating myself. But a number of years ago, I was working for a healthcare payer, and we had grown through acquisition, and one of the things that we had done is extended our service model to the pharmaceutical industry. Now, it definitely was not our original line of service. We were a nurse line prior to that. And when the team asked the leadership to take a step back and make sure that we have the data structured for the appropriate level of usage that we were proposing for this pharmaceutical service, it was decided that we really didn't have time to do that because the service had already been sold. Now, I'm sure that you guys have never talked to a salesperson that already sold something that didn't exist. That never happens. So, long story short, essentially what happened is we were responsible for reporting adverse events to the FDA. And at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, I got a call from an analyst that worked on the team, and she just sort of ominously said to me, I missed a join. And what sort of succeeded from that phone call was a number of late nights working, trying to figure out exactly what the implications were. As it turned out, we failed to report 10 or more adverse events to the FDA as a result of persons being on this medicine. And we were audited by the FDA, or investigated, depending on how you like to look at that. Our client certainly threatened a hefty lawsuit. And really the service line did not survive that kind of influx of pressures. And, in the post-mortem analysis, after all that happened, because we had to do it because our corporate risk attorneys got involved, the team came to a realization that everybody working on the product knew and had warned them about, months and months before that. And that is essentially we had a non-optimized data model. The join that the analyst missed was an easy thing to miss, and anybody else would have probably missed it too, because it required so much understanding of how the data was structured and where the relationships existed and where they did not. So it was just an absolute disaster waiting to happen. And I can tell you from personal experience after going through this that I have never not walked into an organization that's attempting to do business intelligence and data warehousing and said, oh, you can skip the data model, it's not important. Because this experience will forever be etched in my mind. So absolutely, it's sort of a dramatic example, but it is a real-life example of what can happen if you don't appropriately model your data. So feel free to use that with your executives. So then with all of that, how do you proceed, right? And there are generally three ways that organizations proceed in doing a data model. One is they do it in-house, right? They have staff that knows the data really well, may not have a real specific skill set to be a data modeler, maybe they do, but you do it in-house. The second method is that a lot of organizations go out and look to buy a product with a built-in data model. So sometimes they have front-end tools attached to them, but more often than not, they have sort of this black box data model. You buy it lock, stock, and barrel. Sometimes it's more of an open source perspective where you get this baseline model and then you can modify it from there. And then the third is you hire a consultant to come in and do it. And it's one of the three or a combination of the three, or sort of a hybrid approach of the three. But usually that's where data modeling falls in when we start talking about how you actually get this type of work done. That will be important when we start walking through our top 10 top 10 things to consider as you're working on a data model. But first, let's talk about the top 10 reasons why you want to do a data model, brought to you by Lancet. Took me a long time to come up with these. And I don't know if you laugh or not because this is on a webinar. So number 10, it's the only modeling job I'll ever get. Number 9, I've been looking for a legitimate reason to say chicken feed in a meeting. Number 8, I heard the ONC will require one by 2021. Number 7, how else will we incorporate all of that text in the nurse's notes? Number 6, it's the only opportunity we will have to limit the administration's relationships. Number 5, because I need new wallpaper for my cube walls. Number 4, I cannot wait to play Olivia Newton-John's Let's Get Physical. Number 3, it might be fun to do it the right way. Number 2, when do we get to that part where we can actually draw? And the number 1 reason why you want to do a data model is because a consultant said so. So I make fun, right? I joke a little bit, but the fact of the matter is, I do feel strongly that data models are an important part of healthcare. And it took me a long time to come up with 10 funny things to say about data modeling. Okay, so top 10 considerations, and these are real ones, when you are starting to do data modeling. One thing is if you decide to bring all of this in-house, which I think is actually a pretty good approach to doing this work. One of the reasons why is no one's going to know your business as well as you do, and no one's going to know your data as well as you do. I think where this sometimes falls flat is when you don't give your staff the right tools to do the job. So if you've never done a data modeling exercise before, and you're tasked with doing data modeling, you know, it is a whole skill set. There are people that spend their entire professional lives doing only data modeling. So what I really recommend is if you're going to do it this way, that you take some time and you get some training on data modeling. And there's lots of groups that do that out there. But you really want to make sure that you have some formal training on how to do this work, and then you can combine it with all of the knowledge you have about your business and the knowledge that you have about your data, and you'll be better prepared to move forward. So again, there's a lot of argument back and forth about what you document and what you don't. These are generally referred to as logical or conceptual models for data modeling. The agile approach to the work says don't spend time documenting for documentation's sake, just move forward. The typical data modeling person will spend a lot of time, you know, drawing out those boxes and the lines and the relationships. What I've seen happen is that organizations spend a little bit of time in the beginning documenting, and then they completely ignore the logical model after it goes physical, and there's a complete out of sync perspective from the physical versus the logical. What I would say for sure is if you're doing this work for the first time, make absolutely sure that you spend some time getting that model right and presenting it to the business users so that they can look at it and tell you where you have made the correct assumptions and where you haven't. And we'll talk about the team perspective in a minute. But taking the time to get that first logical model correct, I believe is pretty important. So we talked about training, we talked about documenting. There's nothing wrong with doing a little research, right? And there, like I said, there's lots of books, lots of training on this topic. This book in particular, by Len Silverstein, has a healthcare specific data model in it. There's actually a whole bunch of industry specific data models in it. But this one has a healthcare specific one that would really be a good jumping off point for you as an organization. You're not going to be able to take it lock, stock, and barrel and just run with it as is. You're going to have to modify it. But he's got the right core relationships in there that should get you started. So you can do a combination of using your in-house staff that have the right skill sets with a little training. Go out and get this book and focus on that specialized healthcare model, and you'll probably be in a pretty good spot there. So when you are thinking about buying a data model, a lot of organizations want to do this because they feel like it's going to get them from A to Z faster. So they'll go out and they'll take a look at what exists out in the market for this kind of black box data model. And I think, I think it's really tough to do these black box data models really well. I have been a recipient of one as a director of business intelligence, and I've found a lot of challenges with it. So I guess from my perspective of being on the other side of the desk, so to speak, is if you're going to go out and you're going to look at black box data models, so data models that you buy, they're not all bad, so let me start there. But I think there's a couple things that you can do to sort of buffer yourself from a potentially bad situation. One thing is, do a lot of research into the market and see which vendors out there have something that might work for you. The other thing is, once you find that handful of vendors, keep in mind healthcare is a big market. There's lots of different variations of healthcare. So you can't just go out and buy a healthcare data model because it might be focused too far on the payer side or too far on the provider side. So what you want to do is, once you get the vendors narrowed down for the industry perspective that you want, then get a reference call with somebody that has been using the data model for a while, right? And ask them how much have they had to customize it, or to what lengths did they go to customize it. Because if they've told you they've spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours customizing it, you really want to balance the value you're going to get for taking something as a starting point when it sounds like it's really a very small starting point, so to speak. So think about it when you're buying this product, this data modeling product. Think about it just like you'd be buying a BI tool, even though it's below the waterline, so to speak. And get all the reference points. Make sure that you talk to existing clients, understand their level of satisfaction with the organization. Make sure that there's a conversation about how you get in the queue for requests for changes to the product. And I think that's really important. That's one area that I think a lot of organizations that buy these suffer from, is you buy the product, you can't, if you make modifications to that product and the company doesn't upgrade them to correspond to those product updates, and then you have to go get an upgrade to the product, then all the modifications that you've made sort of breaks the product, so to speak. So if they're not listening to your request to make modifications for a certain aspect, because they have so many other clients and there's a long list of product enhancements, what are you going to do in that scenario? Are you going to have a fresh install that's backwards compatible to all of the updates that you've had to make, and that kind of a thing? So really take into consideration that when you think about buying a model, all of those aspects of actually having it deployed in your environment. So here's something that's sort of interesting when you think about data modeling. Sometimes you get this perspective of folks, right, where they have a couple of meetings and then they lock themselves in a room and say, we'll be back in a couple of months with a data model. I'm really not a proponent of doing that sort of aha moment. I really believe strongly that it takes a village to create a data model the right way. So it takes a lot of interviews, a lot of conversations, a lot of trying to understand what people are attempting to get out of the data in order to model that correctly. Because if you don't have a broad-reaching perspective, you might actually miss an important perspective of the data that's coming in the future, or a relationship that you hadn't really considered before. So make sure that any data modeling effort that you do in-house, or even if you decide to bring a consultant on, make sure that you as a team sort of step back and involve as many people as possible, and document a lot of this stuff as much as possible. Even if you choose not to model what that particular group is saying at that specific moment in time, you know that it's coming in the future, and you might be able to accommodate for that in the model itself. So reach out to the broader organization. Make sure you bring on some folks that are traditional data analysts or business analysts in your organization, and ask them the questions about not only what are they doing today, but what do they want to do in the future with these data, and that will really help broaden out that model and avoid sort of that architecting yourselves into a corner in the future. I think the more that you can consider other people's perspectives, the less risk you have in missing something. But again, there's always sort of that balance between that and analysis paralysis too. So pick a date and run with it. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this book in the context of getting the job done. There's a lot of competing books out there. I think that there's no question that this is sort of the Bible of data warehousing. It's very pragmatic in its advice. I like to say that most consultants that I know that do this work have a dog-eared, coffee-stained copy, and a lot of them just now carry it around with them on their iPads. It's a really important book to have, and I highly recommend it if you're starting or if you've been doing this work for a long time and you don't have a copy of this book. And no, I do not get any kickbacks from the Kimball Group for recommending it, but it is a really good book to have. So again, trying to bring some humor to this, the gallery of data modeling consulting, and sort of this idea that I love his use of incomprehensible jargon. And he states the obvious things in such a smart way. There's no question you could bring a consultant on to do this work, right? There, lots of organizations do that. I think again, when you're talking to your executives and you're asking to do this work, and maybe you recognize that the skill set isn't in-house, or if it is, you still feel like because it's so foundational to your BI program and so critical that you really you don't want to risk it, right? You want to bring somebody in that has the expertise to be able to get you started in the right way. And I think that's fine. I work with a lot of consultants that do this data modeling work. But you still want to be sort of leery, right? Because it is so important to the organization and how you move forward for usability and scalability. So one thing that we all always ask, because this is the work that we do, we ask, have you ever done anything in healthcare? And again, just because they've done something in healthcare doesn't always mean it's the healthcare that we're in. So we want to make sure that we ask them those questions about what healthcare experience have they had. Now I do have to say that in modeling, in data modeling in particular, just because they don't have experience in healthcare doesn't necessarily mean that they couldn't model your data. There are some folks out there that have been doing this work for so long that they've probably run into complex situations, probably even more complex situations than healthcare provides. So if they have a fair amount of experience in data modeling, and you feel comfortable with their understanding of complexities and these sort of multidimensional relationships across the data, I think it's okay that they don't have experience in healthcare. One thing you do want to ask is, if the person comes to you sort of cold, not recommended by somebody you trust or something like that, one thing you may want to consider is asking them for a client reference and making sure that you speak with a client who's had the data model active, live, in use for at least a year, because it'll give you a good perspective of the deliverable that the data modeler delivered and how much customization or modification they've had to do in that last year. Now keep in mind that this is a journey, not a destination, so some modification is expected. But if that person says to you, you know what, they delivered something, we thought it was okay, but a month later we had to make big changes, and then 2 months later we had to make even bigger changes, that's a red flag, right? Doesn't mean that something else didn't go down, but that's a good sort of indicator of what could potentially happen again, obviously, because the history is the best predictor of the future. So those are a couple of things that you can do just from a consultant perspective if you choose to bring a consultant on. Always a good idea to get advice from a person that you trust in BI, particularly somebody that does healthcare BI, to see if they've worked with anybody in the past that does this work really well. So I am going to draw a line in the sand and say we talked earlier about this idea that the sort of the big bang versus the deliver value incrementally perspective of data modeling. And for the longest time, I felt that the big bang was the only way to do it. I sort of fell into this perspective of it's just so complicated, and geez, if you forget something or miss something from a relationship perspective, we're really going to be in a pickle. So I want to take as much time as possible to model it correctly the first time, and then we can go from there. Well, I think, you know, the error of my ways really comes down to the fact that you can shut yourself and a team of people inside a room for 6 months and come out with something, and the world has changed so dramatically that that something is no longer valid. So if you think about this, you could have locked yourself in the room in February of 2008 and came out 6 months later, and the world would have been completely different 6 months after that because of the influx of the HITECH Act in early 2009. We all knew it was going to change, but we certainly didn't know the degree to which it would change the work that we do. So, the big bang approach to data modeling, I think, is just really dangerous for healthcare because there's just so much change that's going on. Now, if you do the opposite approach of that, in other words, you sort of model as you go along, one of the dangers of that, of course, is that you can inadvertently architect yourself into a corner. In that if you just have blinders on and you're only focusing on one aspect of the model, you could look up 6 months later and realize that one aspect you focus so much on actually puts yourself in a position where you can't create relationships associated with another aspect of the model. And I've seen that happen too. So I think there's sort of a middle ground that has to happen there, and that goes back to when we talked about, it takes a village. So give yourself a block of time, and this is a little bit of an agile perspective, but give yourself a block of time and identify the top 10 departments that use data in your organization. And of those 10 departments, identify the person in each department that uses the data the most. And start talking to them and start asking them, what are you doing with it today? And what do you want to do with it that you can't do today, right? And start asking those sort of future-based questions and document all of that. And then from that list of stuff, you decide what makes the most sense to start with, sort of this idea that there's a core set of things that each of those 10 departments probably uses, and they don't even realize they're using them all together. And you have that basic foundation to get started, and then you grow from there. And as you're talking to these people, you can consider how you're going to build the future out. So you don't have blinders on, but you're also not taking 6 months to deliver something in a highly dynamic industry. So it's sort of you combine those two things together and take the best of both possible worlds. Take some time, talk to a lot of folks, document some stuff, build from the core of what the data model is, and then expand out from there. Just a shout out, I'm not a data modeler, so I don't have a product that's a preference to me. I do a lot of sort of data modeling counseling for my clients, but I don't sit down and do the data modeling. So I don't have a tool preference, but I do think it's really important that you get the right tool for the job from a data modeling perspective. And there are lots of different choices out there. There are some that are open source, so there's not a big capital investment associated with them. I think one of the major things that you want to make sure when you're purchasing a data modeling tool is that you can make updates to the logical perspective of that model and propagate it to the physical, and vice versa. So if you're making updates to the physical model, it propagates to the logical model, or that view or that look of the data. I think that's probably the most important perspective. Otherwise, you're having to do it twice. You're making updates to your physical, and then in a case where that happens, I don't know any organization that goes back and every time they make a modification to the physical model, they actually go back and document it in the logical model. So that's why I think it's really important to have the right tool for the job. And this really has more to do with succession planning and appropriate documentation for the program overall than it has to do with anything else. So you want to make sure that somebody could step into this position and say, oh, look, here the logical matches the physical, and I'm good to go, and I sort of understand how to proceed. And some guy cutting a pizza with a saw. So, keep in mind that there really is no one right answer. There are significant shades of gray here. Just like this farmer planting this field, right, is that sometimes we're going to use one approach and another time we're going to use a different approach. It doesn't always make sense to bring in a consultant, but at the same time, there are instances where a consultant can get something done for you in 10 days that it would take your organization 6 months to do. So that does make a better investment sense. So, make sure that you're weighing the risks that your organization is reasonable to accept for your organization, I guess, and weigh that out with the cost associated with doing the data model up front or making modifications to the data model long term. So, in conclusion, sort of sound like a professor there, but I think there are 4 basic things that you need to do, right? Is determine how you want to proceed, whether that be buying something, building it yourself, hiring a consultant, maybe a little of each depending on your position. Whatever it is, whatever makes the most sense and is the most comfortable for you from a risk perspective, you determine your approach, right? And then you create the team, because any of those approaches are going to require a team perspective. Sometimes that team's going to be really big where we're interviewing 10 departments with 2 different analysts in each. Sometimes that team is going to be 2 or 3 people because you are working with a product that you bought. But the team is still important because you will need more than one skill set. And then just commit to it and go, right? Sort of you have to move forward with no regrets. Because one of the things I see a lot with data modeling is this, you look at something and then you sort of tweak it, and then you kind of you get into this analysis paralysis because you start to feel the weight of the importance that the exercise is. So I think that as long as you don't put blinders on and you're not modeling with just one thing in mind, you should be fine. But just commit to that approach and move forward. And then just settle in for the journey, because this really is a journey, not a destination. I tell my clients all the time, I think that the best you can ever hope for is 80% of your data model in your environment. Our industry changes too fast to assume that you'll ever have 100%. Some of you may get 100%, but I just think that's pretty rare because we're always making changes, we're always modifying things. So if you can strive for 80% of your data being modeled in the environment, you're doing pretty good. Okay, that's the end of it. This is me, my contact information. Feel free to drop me a note or a question any old time. If you really liked my top 10, I'd be happy to give those to you. Also, one note, Lancet just recently released a healthcare specific website. You can find us at lancethealth.com. And let's see here, looks like we have a couple of questions. Yeah, let me click around here a little bit. Okay. So looking for advice, that they have a less than optimized model that's deeply embedded. Yeah, that's really tough. I think one of the biggest challenges with doing this work is always when you have a situation where you have a model that's been up and running for a while and you realize that it's not what it needs to be in order for you to get the job done. And that's always really hard. It's sort of like, the analogy of changing your tires when you're going 60 miles an hour, because it's not like you can shut down the warehouse for a couple of months, redo it, and then launch it back out. So there's a couple of things you can do. One of them would be, try to determine where the model falls flat. Is it that you don't have all the data that you need? Is it not optimized for scalability? Is it suffering from performance issues because multiple joins in weird places? That kind of a thing. If you can sort of isolate where the specific issue is, then you can actually determine how big it is to fix. If it's just a couple of things where you just have to add on a whole new entity, and the relationships exist to make that appropriate, and you don't sort of bastardize the rest of the model, that's okay. But if you have a situation where there's the star schema model and there's the snowflake schema, and what I generally refer to as the yarn ball data model, which means that all the if you look at a logical perspective of that model, all of these relationships are all over and you can't make hide nor hair of them. If you have a situation like that, you're probably in a position to have to unplug and redo, and there's no easy way to do that. I think the biggest thing is get support from an executive to make that modification, and you can always talk about risk associated with it, risk of exposure, risk of not getting data the way that you need it, all of those kinds of things. And then what you'll have to do during deployment, right, is you will have to have two things up running parallel for a period of time until you're ready to switch over to the new thing. But I empathize with you. That's not an easy position to be in. Okay. So here's one from somebody that looks like somebody that purchased a product a few years ago that had a data model. They had requested updates, but the organization hasn't responded, so they made their own modifications. So this is exactly what I was talking about earlier from a product perspective, maybe what prompted the question. So now they want us to upgrade, but we can't do it without breaking a bunch of stuff. Any guidance? Yeah, that's one of the downsides of purchasing one of these models, and it primarily has to do with upgrades. One of the areas that obviously we're all looking at looming sort of around the corner is this ICD-10, and I think that folks that have purchased data models that have modified them might be in a real pickle. I guess for those of you that are looking to purchase a data model, one thing you want to make sure you understand is if you make modifications and then you have to make an upgrade or you need support, they're probably going to ask you to go back to the original install so that they can help you from there. Sort of almost like a software perspective to that, but if you've made modifications and then you don't have an install that you can peel back to, or you've made so many modifications that you're worried that upgrading might actually break it. The good thing is in a lot of these in a lot of this work, you don't really need to take the upgrades from a data modeling vendor like this. There's nothing that forces that unless you have front-end software tied to it. In the case where something like an ICD-10, where it's so fundamental to the model, you might want to start thinking about that now, from a how do you take advantage of them doing all the work to do that upgrade. There's no easy answer for you. If you really feel like you need the upgrade, then you're going to have to figure out how to work with them. Maybe do a fresh install and then start your customizations over. It might be a good idea for you to try to review the customizations that you've done and make sure that they're all really necessary. Make a sort of a list of modifications and what they do and how they do it, and then peel all of them back out so you have a fresh install or something like that. I recognize that it's not a happy place to be right now, but those are probably your best options. Not good ones, I know, I'm sorry. And then finally, just a documentation question: how much time should we dedicate to updating the logical model? I'm not a big advocate of documentation for documentation's sake, for sure. What I would say again is just buy the right tool, and then they're always in sync. That way you don't have to have a special, you haven't made a special assignment to go out and update the logical model. It happens as a course of making updates to the model itself. So that would be my my biggest piece of advice there. I'm assuming you don't have a product like that, otherwise you wouldn't be asking about how much time to dedicate. So I would really recommend that you consider buying a tool where those two things are always sort of kept up kept in sync. Otherwise, just how much time should you invest in just doing a logical model? Probably not a ton. I would make sure that any major modifications you make to the model, the physical model, I'm assuming that's what you're doing, you make sure that at some point in the future that there's the corresponding updates to the logical side. Particularly for any reason you're going to go on vacation for a long period of time, you're taking a trip to Europe or something like that, somebody's going to take over for you, make sure that all of your documentation is up to speed. Or if you're as a program, you're doing a big project, make sure that all of that baseline documentation is up to speed before you move forward. So, and I think that's all the questions we had. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I appreciate it. I know this is pretty high-level stuff, but if you have any other detailed questions that you'd like to ask, you feel free to drop me a note there at my email address. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon.